Welcome back, guys. Today we're on our crew cab OBS truck. So today the plan is we're going to block out the side of this truck. If you watched the last video, we got everything going. We were just ready to drive it. Boom, we had a blowout and we didn't get to take it down the road, and we're still waiting on tires. So while we're waiting, why not go ahead and start blocking this out and get it straight? So the problem with the truck right now is, if you saw the video of the truck top and bottom, you can tell it was really well built, very nice truck, and I can tell whoever did it, they really knew what they were doing. The problem now is it's got a lot of waves, wiggles, dents going down the bedside. Now, were they there or not? I don't know, but I know over the years that, products shrink, so I'm sure it's probably moved a little bit. I can tell like there's been people leaning on the truck. There's a couple of dings in the door. So I'm going to predict it was probably pretty good to begin with, and these problems have kind of come up more recently. So the big thing today is going to be, can we go over the top of what is here? And I'm going to show you how we're going to figure that out. Another thing is I'm going to show you everything that we're using today as far as the products we're using to block on it and all that. Also, we got a couple little dings and dents. I've got a Maxi dent repair system that I've been itching to show you guys because it trumps every dent repair tool that we've ever had, and I've really been trying to find a spot to show you that. So hopefully we can do that today. Now, here's the thing with, can we go over the top of this? Now, in the paint world, if you're involved in it, there's a lot of debate on a lot of different things. And let me start by saying there are many, many ways in the paint world to get a good result. A lot of shops have different ways they like to do it. One thing that I like to do, and I kind of live by, is the data sheets. So for instance, if we're going to lay down an Evercoat filler or putty or anything like that, the first thing I do is print out that data sheet, and it's going to tell me everything about that filler. What we can apply it over, how thick can we apply it, how does it need to be applied, what temperature do we apply it in. It's all right there. So if you follow the data sheets, which go all the way up through your clear coat, and you're following how they've designed that product, you're doing it right. Because I see a lot of debate, especially we did really deep dives into all of this stuff hosting Truck Tech and Carfix, because we're showing you all of the best ways we can of how to do this. So I've got a lot of knowledge in this, and plus we've done it for a long time, so we've really found what works. So one of the things is how thick does it need to be before we strip it? And like I said, that's kind of debatable. So if you take a mill scale gauge, here's one right here. This is a digital one. You just put it against the paint, boop, and it's going to tell you how thick your paint is. Now a mil is not millimeter, 1/1000th of an inch. So if you have 30 mils, that's about the thickness of a credit card. So there's a couple places on this truck that I found some problem areas that won't even read, and it's reading about 90 around it. So I'm going to guess we're about 100 mils plus. So that means we're 3 or more credit card thickness in that spot. Now, if you take that and you go to a dealership where you have brand new cars and you put it on there, what we found when we went and did this, not just going off the internet I think used to say like 4 to 6 or 4 to 7 mils. I was finding that most new paint jobs were around 9 or 10 mils. There were some that were 4 and 5, and then I found a lot that were 9, 10, 12. So it's thicker than what they're saying. And what I have found talking to the paint manufacturers, some of the scientists behind all this stuff, there is no real number as far as thickness that says, yes, at this number it will fail. There isn't one. So what I live by in that is, let's try to be as thin as we can, because that's just less chance of failure. And I think with a restoration, you're stripping it to bare metal, laying down a coat of epoxy, polyester primer blocking it, polyester primer blocking it again, urethane primer sanding it down, base coat, clear coat. Then if you do graphics, you're clearing over that, then you're going to sand that clear down, probably clear it again. There's no real way to keep it at 4 to 10 mils when you do something like that. We have a Camaro over here that was stripped to bare metal, minimal filler work, epoxy, and it's in its first round of polyester primer. And just in those 3 coats of primer, it's about 15 mils. Now we're going to block all that off. But I think in the restoration custom paint world, if you're staying in 20 to 25 mils, you're doing pretty good. And we've got 20-year-old builds that have no cracking, no blistering, no anything like that. So I feel pretty good about that. So going around it, let's see what we've got. Okay, well, one of these digital mill scale readers, you can get these things off Amazon pretty cheap. They also have magnet ones. I don't really like the magnet ones. They're a little harder to actually get a good read on it. All right, so there we're at 18.48. Now we have to think if we're going to block that, we're going to block a lot of that material off. So, you know, we may get down to, you know, could get down to 5 or 6 mils. So that's 23 down there, so that tells me there's probably a little bit of filler that's been added there, but everything looks really good. Okay, so we're at 67. So we're even more, it's going to be welded in right there, so that's probably the most. The problem that a lot of people will run into with something like this on a bed where that gas door is that tail light filler is probably welded in somewhere in that area, and that's where we're getting some of those higher readings, like 71 right there. When you weld, you're shrinking the metal. So when you shrink the metal, if you're butting it together and you're welding it, let's say probably with this back then, probably a MIG, I'm not sure, it's gonna sink in. So as that weld sinks in when it shrinks, it's more filler you have to add. So typically when we're doing metal work, we're gonna weld that in, but then we're gonna planish it. Problem with this is you can't get to the back side of it to planish it back out. So like nowadays what we do is if I were going to do this and weld this in, I would cut this inside panel out more than likely if I were to get enough shrinkage to do that, and I would get in there and I would planish that back out. Now that's a lot of work, but to me it's worth it. But if you take your time, especially when we're TIG welding, we can really control our heat, go through and just tack it in and go very slow. A lot of times you can get it welded in without a lot of shrinkage and it's not going to dive in very much and you can just kind of skim coat that. But just something that we have to do if we need to access the back of a panel to planish it out. So I would predict that's what happened. Still looks really good, no swelling, can't really see the weld seam or anything like that. So we're just going to block on it, we're going to get it straight, and we're going to see how much thickness we cut off of here. Now let me show you this one on the passenger side. So right here we've got a crack, and we've got a crack here. And here to here, I can see this entire thing is blistered. I can push it, it moves, so it's completely released from the panel. This right here though, we're gonna strip this section down. There's nothing else really swelling or cracking. We're gonna block the entire bed sides and prime those, and on the doors, they're not as bad. There's just a couple little dents, so I think we're gonna do more spot repair on those like you would do in the collision kind of world. So we'll address that when we get there, but let's start getting our blocks, our paper, and scratch this thing up. So the blocks I like to use, I use Big Kid blocks. They've got a lot of nice acrylic blocks over there. They've got thin ones that have a little bit of flex to them. They've got thicker ones that don't have any movement at all. And the other blocks I like to use are actually a billet block. These do not lie at all because they do not move. They're laser straight, and you're going to get straight with that. You cannot obviously go over any curves with these, where this would be a lot better for that. I don't tend to use any of these rubber style blocks because once they move, they just stay moved, and you're not going to really get it flat with those. So I'm going to start with this billet block and 120 grit because we want to cut a good amount of product off of there to get it flat. And once we start blocking, you're going to see real quick how straight or not straight the panel is. Now with this bedside having a slight curve all the way front to back, we don't want to get too long of a block because we're just going to end up sanding right in the center section of the block. So this is almost the perfect length. really big roll in it. All right, I'm gonna go grab my mask. I left it off for a second just so I could talk to you while I was doing that, but definitely when you're doing this, you wanna wear a mask. This stuff's not good for you, so I'm not gonna block any more until I get one on. All right, so we've got most of that bad stuff blocked out down through here now because those shiny spots were basically working as our guide coat. That was telling us that there were low spots in the panel. So these spots now are where we're breaking through the clear coat into the base. So our low spots, you know, would have been here in between. These are a little high. Basically now what we've done is we've blocked all this down level. You'll also notice that most of this is flat. And I've got a really rigid block, so I'm staying on the flat surfaces. Where this little wheel well section starts to curve out, I'm making sure not to block into that curve. If we block into that, we're just gonna cut a big nasty groove in it, end up having to sand that out. So we'll use a little softer block here that'll kind of roll with that transition. And then we're gonna block the top of the bedside with that rigid block as well. But most of that is actually blocking out a lot better than I thought. We've got most of it taken out down through there, so it's gonna make a huge difference in the appearance of this truck. So just like the top, anything that's flat, we're gonna block with the rigid block. So we have this body line that runs down here to the lower part of the bedside. So we're also gonna just block over that to make sure that's good and straight. So there, a couple little wiggles. There's a ton of clear coat on this thing. thing we've got to make sure of is we don't sand anything we don't want to paint. For instance, like we've got a great breaking point right here from the bedside to the header panel that we can mask right there, which means we don't have to paint that header panel. So, good thing to do, put a couple of pieces of tape down just in case you slip up and run the block over there, you're not scratching up the good paint. Because if you end up scratching into that, more than likely you're going to have to paint it and just created yourself a lot more work. Okay, so here's where we are now. We've got most of this blocked out. Now the worst of it was here to here, roughly the center part of this bedside had a lot of really gnarly waves in it and on the top of the bedside. So we started out with the Endasa Redline 120 paper on a really rigid block. We blocked that out, then I swapped over to 180 and we blocked those 120 grit scratches out to 180. Once again, we're going to go to our Evercoat Eurofill urethane primer that we're going to put on here, but we're going to get their data sheet and we're going to see what they recommend for where we prep that out to, whether that be 320 or we leave it in 180. Typically, I'm leaving that in 180. Down here, there's nothing wrong with anything down here, so we're not going to sand it that aggressive down low because we're not going to get any primer down there. So we'll end up masking all this up and we'll just wet sand this down low and prepare that for paint. So I'll show you how we do all that. We've got a pretty good dent at the bottom of this bedside where the truck probably sat down onto something. It's bent the bracing in here too, so I think what we're gonna do next is probably get it up in the air, get the wheel off of it and start working this dent out. And then we'll go to that other bedside over there and start looking at that spot that was released, see about stripping that and blocking those bedsides. So we're gonna basically do what we need to do on the bed before we move to the cab, because when we get up here, we're gonna end up removing the door handles and the moldings and stuff like that. So we'll get the bed finished up before we get up there. All right, so we've got it up, and I think it goes without saying, but I'm going to say it anyway. When you have an adjustable suspension, especially when it lays on the ground, never get under this thing unless you have jack stands under the frame. Because if for some reason an airline blew out or anything happened, you had your arm under there, it's gone. So anyway, just a safety note. So what we've got, if you look down low, we're caved in right here. So the truck probably sat down on something. See, it's also put a little bend in this brace, so we're going to straighten this brace back up. It's going to help push this back down a little bit. We'll probably do a little bit of hammer and dolly work right here to try to straighten this back out, along with we're going to go get our Maxi dent repair system. We're going to roll that over here. We'll probably need some tools out of that. We'll start working this thing out. All right, so this is our Maxi steel repair station. It's from Dent Fix Equipment. If you don't know Dent Fix Equipment, definitely check them out. I first saw them at SEMA some years ago, and it was one of those deals where I thought, I've got to have one of those. So anytime I see something tool-wise that I've got to have, that's kind of, I end up getting it. I've got a problem. But I have to say, most of the time when I go get a new piece of equipment or a new tool, it's very rare that my guys here will come back to me and go, man, I love that thing. But this is one that they've come back over and over again and tell me how much they love it. I've actually done a video on this that I haven't posted yet that I'm eager to show you guys, but I had something specific I was doing with it on the Datsun, and since we're on the OBS, we might not get to that. So I'm going to do a standalone video of this by itself. That way you can really see what all it does, because there's so many different functions in this one box. And as much as my guys use it over in the body shop, and as much as I've used it over here on the metal side, this by far is probably the best piece of equipment that we have in the shop as far as metal repair or straightening out metal, especially we do our original builds. And I would have to say, we're not in collision, but if I were a collision person, I think this is what would be right up your alley for that. But let's just do a quick overview of this, and we'll hop into trying to repair this spot. I'm hoping we can maybe utilize a lot of stuff in here, but when we open up the top, we've got the Maxi. Now this machine can do quite a few different things. So we can weld on welding rods, wiggle wire, pins, and we can also shrink with this. So with the welding wire and the keys and the pins, now these are zip tied together, but this is wiggle wire. So if we had a long crease, we could weld this entire thing into that crease, and then we could use our claws to grab a hold of the wiggle wire to pull it out. I have to say, the wiggle wire is probably one of my favorite ones so far, because you can move so much metal at one time, and I've found that I really like that. The other one that I really like are the keys. So we can weld these keys on and use the pullers to pull it out. We also have leverage bars in here. This would obviously go against the panel. This would grab one of the keys, and you can use that for leverage. That works really well. I've used this one a bunch. So on the other end of this machine, if you're familiar with a stud gun used for pulling dents, where you put a stud into the gun, you weld the stud onto the panel, then you use your puller and you pull it out, then you have to clip the stud, then you have to grind it down. It gets kind of messy, gets kind of lumpy. I'm sure if you've used one, you know what I mean. Well, this, we have these different attachments that we can put on here. So with this one in particular, we can zap the end of this into our dent. We've got a small puller, can go over the top, zap it in, little pull, twist it off. Zap it in, little pull, twist it off. It's amazing. It's very fast, it's very clean. It doesn't leave all those crazy lumps like you would have with the stud gun. And that's just one of the things that does. We have a lot of different attachments that go into that. So in this whole unit right here, it can do many, many different things. We're going to get into that later on when we do the standalone video on it. So for now, what we're going to do is we're going to get into our hammers and dollies, which are really awesome in this kit too. I've had snap-on hammers for about 20 years, the same two that I love, and I'd never use a different one. And one of my guys a while back ended up using the hammer and dolly out of this. He wanted to give it a try, came and told me how quickly he was moving metal with it. So when I tried it, I was amazed with it, and I think it's because the way that they're weighted. They feel really good. They're a little bit heavier. You see they've got a thick head. The dollies are also thick. So what I liked about that was it only takes a little bit of effort to move some metal. So we're going to use these. We're going to start seeing if we can move that brace a little bit, straighten that back out, and then we'll probably hammer and dolly this low spot, and we might end up having to use the Maxi. If we don't, we'll get to that in another video. But if you are definitely in the business of repairing dents and doing body work, I would urge you to check this out, because I was really blown away with it. Okay, so we've seen the dent. Basically what we're going to do with a dent is there's direct damage and there's indirect damage. The direct damage is where it actually took the impact. So I can see the worst part of this, and that's where it took the impact. And then we have indirect damage, and that's basically everything else that happens from that one impact. So this is kind of our indirect damage kind of runs out the panel a little bit. So we're going to start working this brace back in. It's going to help move this metal back to where it wants to go. And then we'll start hammer and dollying some of this back down. Right, move that quite a bit. All right, so I've got you guys looking at the back side of it now. Maybe you can see that a little better. It's just a weird spot. So what I'm doing right now is I'm hammering off dolly, and we're moving the metal back by doing that. So what that means is hammering off dolly means I'm putting pressure around the outer crown of the dent, and I'm hammering onto the dent. So I'm not hammering on the dolly, I'm hammering off to the side of the dolly. Now, if we were hammering on dolly, we would be stretching the metal. So what we're going to do right now is we're going to hammer off dolly until we work it close to back into shape, and then we're going to hammer on dolly to kind of stretch it out just a little bit and even it back up. We've moved it a lot because right here was roughly about right there when we started. We were about an inch higher than that. So I've got the dolly right on the crown of that dent where it's a bit high. And now we're working the low spot back down. All right, you can also see coming down this pinch weld right on the lip, we've got a kick out right here. Now that's part of that indirect damage. It took a hit down here, but it's moved the metal over here. So we're going to straighten that back out. That's also going to help relieve some of that pressure and let that metal go back. Okay, so this whole thing was caved in almost 3 inches. It was pretty bad. So we've got it, for the most part, worked out, roughed in. We still have to cut the bolt out of there, work it out a little more. So we'll do that a little later, but you can see where we basically welded the rod on and just used the slide hammer to bang it out. It only took a second to go through there. There was a pretty bad crease along. We just worked that right out, no problem. So we still have a little more to work out right here, but I'm going to wait to cut that bolt out, so we'll do that in a little bit. Let's hop over to the other side. All right, I worked that bolt out of there off camera. I've got all that pretty much done on the other side, so we're going to see what's going on right here. We're cracked here, and it looks like it's released all the way down through here. So we're just going to see. think what happened here is moisture was the culprit. So if you look down through here, there's a lot of surface rust that started, which tells me there must have been some moisture either under that filler, in that filler, maybe in the primer that's on here. Very well could have been that, and it just kind of released from there. So it was a pretty big pocket. Luckily, other than one more on the truck, it's the only one I've seen. So hopefully we can take this down and work it back out. All right, so move the OBS over here in front of the booth, since this is kind of our nights and weekends toy. I don't want it taking up the main shop, so we've got it moved over here, plus when we prime it, we're gonna put it in the booth and do that anyway. Okay, so I went ahead and I've feathered all of this out. I've taken a lot of the material out that was there. So what I've done is I've taken it down far enough that everywhere out here, our mill scale gauge is reading pretty thin. We're showing about 9 mils around through here, so that's really good. I worked some of this metal out up here, so now that that's worked out, hopefully by the time we just skim over this, prime block paint, all that, we're only gonna be not too far over what we have right now, which is really good, and that's kind of where we want to be. What we're using is the Evercoat Optics filler, and if you go off the data sheet, it wants this prepped in 80 to 180. So we've got everything prepped in 80 right now. I'm going to go ahead and mix up some filler, spread it out, and go ahead and filler work this section. We also had one down low. This had a pretty good dent in it. I hammered and dollied that out. We've got that feather edged out, and we're going to go ahead and apply a little filler there too. Now with this filler, you can't apply it over bare steel, and since we don't have very much steel showing anyway, we're going to go ahead and do that, and we'll start blocking it out. So we're using Evercoat Rage Optics. That's the filler we're going to use on the truck, what we use on all of our builds. Really like this filler, easy sanding, not a lot of pinholes when you use this, if any. And this has a color changing technology, so you can see that it's pink. It's actually going to change color, and that's going to tell us when it's ready to sand. So instead of dragging your block across it or touching it or whatever, this is actually going to let us know right when it's ready. I've also got my Endasa mixing board. I like using mixing boards as opposed to cardboard like a lot of people use, because the cardboard actually soaks up the resins from the activator and the filler itself. So a lot of times you're not really getting the full benefit of what you're using because the cardboard has pulled some of that out of there. So there's quite a few different ways that you can mix this. If you've got a scale, you can do it by weight. Another way you can do it, if you have roughly a 4-inch puddle of filler, you can go side to side with your activator, and that's usually going to get you really close, and that's what Evercoat's data sheet even says. The way I typically look at it, because we're not mixing up a ton, is for every golf ball size of filler, I use about a pea size of activator, and that always gets it really close as well. So there's a few different ways you can mix that up. We're going to go just a little more, because on this first pass, we're going to apply a little more on there than we really need, because we're going to block it all off. And then typically my second pass, if we need one, that's just going to be a really, really tight skim coat. Another thing I do is I mix the hardener off to the side of the filler as opposed to going across it, because let's just say that you lay that on there and then something happens and you have to run off. Well, that's going to activate on top of your filler, and I don't like that. So if something were to happen right now and I needed to leave, this is still here ready to go when we get back. All right, we've ran out of time for this one. We actually did a lot more than just this, but I ran out of time editing the video. But we did get this spot stripped down. We got the metal worked out a little bit. We got it filler worked in our Evercoat filler. Feels really good. And then with our mills gauge on here, we're only reading about 6 or 7 now. So we took all that material off we had before, and now we were able to get it pretty thin. Now, another thing with that mill thickness, we talked about it in the beginning where I was saying that, you know, if you're in this kind of restoration world where you're doing fillers, putties, polyester primers, urethanes, base, clear, maybe clear again, yeah, it's hard to stay in that 4 to 9 that they say you want to be in. But you also have to think, when they're referring to that, they're talking about sealer, base, and clear coat. So with sealer, base, and clear, even though right here we're at about 7 or 8 mils, and we're going to prime this and we're going to block it, and then we're going to base and we're going to clear it, we might get up to that 15, 16, 17, maybe a little more mill thickness, but you got to think our sealer, our base, and our clear, we still are in that 4 to 7 probably range once I'm done with base and clear. So this goes back to following those data sheets 100%. I will preach that till the end, because the Evercoat filler that we used, if you go off their data sheet, they say that you can apply it up to a 1/4 inch thick. Now, I wouldn't apply it a 1/4 inch thick, and I don't really recommend you to apply it a 1/4 inch thick if you don't have to, but they say you can. So like this, by the time we're done, we've really only done a skim coat here. And that's what I'm normally trying to do, is just a skim coat. Get the metal a little better, do a skim coat, prime it a time or two, you're ready to go. And if you're following those data sheets from your fillers all the way up to your clear coats, and you're doing what those manufacturers tell you to do, you're going to be totally fine. So anyway, everything's looking really good. We did get the side of the truck pretty much prepped. We still have a little more sanding to do on this side. We ran into a couple of problem spots up front, not a big deal. We'll take care of those next week. We got all the trim and rubber removed around the door, so we're not masking and painting against any of that. And we got the door handles out, and then we've got the interior removed because we're going to wrap everything in leather too. This was painted plastic. I can see that it was sanded and prepped really well. It was primed. Everything was probably done how it should have been, but it's really hard for this paint to last over this, especially when there's some flex in it. You know, if you try to pry a panel off, it's going to be really hard not to bust it. You can see just how much it's released. So as opposed to sanding all that off and painting it again, and probably at some point down the road it might do this same thing, we're going to wrap it in leather. We've got Apex leather coming, square weave carpet on the way, and we'll just bring it up, give it a little more of a luxury kind of look. I think it'll really suit this truck, and I'm excited to get to that. But next week we're going to continue on this, trying to get everything prepped for paint. We'll get this into primer. We'll take care of the rest of our spots, and hopefully next week we're priming and we're blocking that out, getting it ready for paint. But anyway, I appreciate you guys watching as always. Appreciate the comments. And also don't forget, tomorrow is the Vim Tool giveaway, giving away 2 socket sets. If you haven't entered, make sure to subscribe to this channel and comment Vim Tools. That enters you. Also go over and subscribe to Vim Tools themselves. It's definitely worth going and checking those guys out. If you want to enter twice, head over to my Instagram or Facebook, find the giveaway post. You'll see it. It's 2 socket sets posted up, and just follow those instructions and you're entered twice. So hopefully sometime tomorrow, I'll make some sort of announcement during the day. We're going to try to do that giveaway. So we've got everybody, as of right now, who's entered, kind of in a database. We're going to do a random pick, and hopefully somebody tomorrow's getting some new tools. So we just want to show you that we appreciate you guys watching, and we hope we can help you out. So anyway, see you guys next time.